The first time the stray dog appeared, nobody noticed him. Not really. He was just a thin, muddy shape standing at the edge of the cemetery road, half hidden behind a row of wet maple trees, watching the funeral procession move slowly through the gray morning. Rain had fallen before dawn, leaving the gravel path dark and shining, and the black funeral cars crawled toward the old churchyard like a line of shadows. Inside the second car, Margaret Ellis sat with both hands folded tightly in her lap. At 64, Margaret had the kind of quiet face people often mistook for strength. Her silver hair was pinned neatly beneath a black hat. Her dark coat was buttoned to her throat. She did not cry loudly. She did not collapse. She simply stared forward through the windshield as the hearse carried her husband Daniel toward the place where she would have to say goodbye. Daniel Ellis had been her husband for 38 years. He had been the man who fixed broken shelves before she ever asked, the man who whistled old country songs while making coffee, the man who always left one porch light on because, as he liked to say, no house should look like it gave up waiting. And now he was gone. A heart attack, the doctor had said. Sudden, fast, nothing anyone could have done. Those words had been repeated to Margaret so many times that they no longer sounded like comfort. They sounded like a door closing. In the car beside her, their son Peter sat stiffly, checking his phone every few minutes. He was 40, well-dressed, clean-shaven, and restless in a way that made grief look inconvenient to him. His wife Caroline sat on his other side, dabbing at perfectly dry eyes with a folded tissue. "We'll get through this," Peter murmured, not looking at his mother. "After today, we can start handling the estate properly." Margaret turned her head slowly. "The estate?" she asked. Peter cleared his throat. "I only mean there will be paperwork. The house, Dad's accounts, the shop building. We should not delay everything." The shop building. Margaret looked back through the rain-streaked window. Daniel's old carpentry shop sat on the edge of town beside the railroad tracks. He had built cabinets there for half the county. He had repaired church pews for free, made rocking horses for children, and once spent 2 weeks restoring a stranger's dining table because the woman said it was the last thing her father had made. That little shop was not worth much compared to what Peter imagined, but to Margaret it was part of Daniel's soul. "Not today," she whispered. Peter sighed softly as if she were being difficult. Outside, the funeral car turned through the iron cemetery gate. That was when the stray dog began to follow. He emerged from the trees with careful steps. He was medium-sized, maybe some shepherd, maybe some collie, maybe something else entirely. His fur was soaked and tangled, brown and white beneath the mud. One ear stood upright while the other folded over. He walked with a slight limp, but he kept his eyes fixed on the hearse. At first, one of the drivers noticed him in the side mirror. Then a woman in the third car pointed. Then Peter frowned and leaned forward. "Is that dog following us?" he muttered. Margaret looked. The dog was trotting behind the hearse now, staying close but not too close, as if he knew exactly where he belonged in the procession. When the car slowed near the cemetery chapel, he slowed too. When the hearse stopped, the dog stopped. A few mourners whispered, "Poor thing. Maybe he lives around here. Someone should shoo him away." But the dog did not bark. He did not beg. He did not wander between the cars looking for attention. He simply stood in the rain and watched Daniel's coffin. Margaret felt something strange stir beneath her grief. Daniel had always loved dogs. He had never been able to pass a stray without offering food, water, or at least a gentle word. Years ago, when Peter was still a boy, Daniel had brought home an injured hound he found beside the highway. Margaret had protested for exactly 10 minutes before she was boiling chicken for the poor creature and making a bed out of old towels. "Animals know," Daniel had told her once. "They know more than people think." Now, as pallbearers lifted Daniel's coffin from the hearse, the muddy dog took 2 steps forward. The funeral director, Mr. Harlan, raised a hand. "Shoo," he said gently. "Go on now." The dog lowered his head but did not leave. Mr. Harlan tried again, stepping closer. The dog backed away only enough to keep space between them. His eyes remained fixed on the coffin. Margaret watched the animal carefully. There was something tied to his collar. At first she thought it was a scrap of cloth or a piece of trash caught in the buckle, but when the dog shifted, she saw it more clearly, a small blue ribbon, and beneath it something wrapped in plastic. Her breath caught. Daniel's favorite color had been blue, not bright blue, not navy, a soft faded blue, like the work shirts he wore until the elbows thinned and Margaret begged him to throw them away. He used to tie blue ribbons around jars of homemade jam when they gave them to neighbors at Christmas because he said it made everything look kind. The dog turned his head and the plastic packet tapped lightly against his chest. Margaret stepped away from Peter. "Mother," Peter said sharply, "where are you going?" She did not answer. Rain dotted her black coat as she walked slowly toward the dog. The mourners fell silent behind her. Even the pallbearers paused with the coffin held steady between them. The dog watched her approach. He did not run. When Margaret was only a few feet away, she crouched carefully, though her knees ached and the wet gravel soaked the hem of her skirt. "Hello, sweetheart," she whispered. The dog's ears moved at the sound of her voice. His eyes were dark, tired, and full of something Margaret could not name. Hunger, maybe, fear, loyalty, grief. "Did you know my Daniel?" she asked softly. Behind her, someone let out a small sob. The dog took one step closer. Margaret slowly lifted her hand. The animal sniffed her fingers, then pressed his wet nose against her palm. And then he whimpered. It was not a frightened sound. It was a broken one. Margaret's throat tightened. She reached for the little packet tied to his collar. The blue ribbon had been knotted carefully, protected beneath a strip of clear tape. Whoever had tied it there had wanted it to survive rain, mud, and time. Her fingers trembled as she loosened it. Peter came up behind her quickly. "Mom, leave it," he said under his breath. "It's probably garbage." Margaret looked up at him. There was something in his face that did not belong at a funeral, not sadness, alarm. Her hand closed around the packet. "I want to see what it is," she said. Peter's jaw tightened. "This is not the time." Margaret stood slowly. The dog moved with her, staying so close his wet shoulder brushed her coat. She opened the plastic. Inside was a folded piece of paper, old notebook paper, Daniel's handwriting. Margaret knew it before she read a single word. Her legs almost gave out. Mr. Harlan hurried forward. "Mrs. Ellis?" Margaret unfolded the page. The ink had blurred slightly near the edges, but the words were still clear. "Maggie, if this dog finds you, it means I could not bring him home myself. His name is Scout. He has been staying near the old shop for 3 weeks. I think someone dumped him out by the railroad tracks. I was feeding him, trying to earn his trust. He is gentle but scared. Please do not let Peter take the shop. There are things there he does not want you to find. I am sorry I did not tell you sooner. Look under the loose floorboard beneath my workbench. Trust no one with this except Ruth. I love you more than any words I ever knew how to say. Daniel." For a moment the cemetery disappeared. Margaret heard only the rain. Then Peter reached for the note. "Give me that." Margaret stepped back. The dog moved between them. A low growl rose from his chest. Not loud, not wild, a warning. Peter froze. Every mourner saw it. Caroline grabbed Peter's sleeve. "Peter," she whispered, "stop." Margaret stared at her son, the boy she had raised, the man Daniel had worried about more and more over the past few years, the son who had started visiting only when he needed money, the son who had urged Daniel to sell the shop, the son who had already asked about the estate before his father was even buried. "What did your father mean?" Margaret asked quietly. Peter's face flushed. He was confused. You know, Dad had been acting strange lately. "No," Margaret said. "He was grieving nothing. He was sick with worry, maybe, but he was not confused." The funeral director gently cleared his throat. "Mrs. Ellis, would you like a moment?" Margaret folded the note carefully and held it against her chest. "No," she said, looking toward Daniel's coffin. "We will bury my husband first." The service went on beneath a sky the color of ash. The pastor spoke about Daniel's kindness, his patient hands, his quiet generosity. People nodded and cried. A former employee from the carpentry shop described how Daniel had once paid his rent during a bad winter and never told anyone. An elderly neighbor said Daniel repaired her porch steps every spring without asking for money. A young woman Margaret barely knew said Daniel had made a cradle for her baby when she could not afford one. Through it all, Scout stayed beside Margaret. Nobody tried to move him again. When Daniel's coffin was lowered, Scout lay down at the edge of the grave and rested his head between his paws. Rain darkened the soil. Margaret dropped a white rose onto the coffin. Her hand trembled, but her voice did not. "Goodbye, my love," she whispered. Scout gave a soft whine, and Margaret finally cried. Not politely, not quietly. She cried from the deepest place inside her, one hand covering her mouth, the other resting on the wet head of a dog she had never seen before that morning, a dog who had somehow carried Daniel's last warning back to her. After the burial, people tried to speak to her, but Margaret barely heard them. Ruth Bennett pushed gently through the crowd. Ruth had been Margaret's closest friend for 40 years. She was 66, sharp-eyed, practical, and not easily intimidated. She had known Daniel since he was a lanky young man with sawdust in his hair and a ring box hidden in his jacket pocket. When Ruth saw Margaret's face, she asked only one question. "What happened?" Margaret handed her the note. Ruth read it once, then again. Her expression hardened. "We go to the shop now," Ruth said. Peter appeared beside them. "Absolutely not." Ruth turned slowly. "Excuse me?" "My father was buried 10 minutes ago," Peter snapped. "And now you want to chase some ridiculous message tied to a stray dog?" Margaret studied him. "Why are you so afraid of a floorboard?" Peter's mouth opened. Nothing came out. Caroline whispered, "Peter, maybe we should just let her—" "Stay out of it," he hissed. Ruth stepped closer. "You do not speak to your wife like that in front of me, Peter Ellis." The dog growled again. Several mourners looked over. Peter forced himself to smile, but it was thin and ugly. "Fine, go. Dig through the shop. You will find dust, tools, and more proof that Dad was losing his mind." Margaret looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned away. "Come on, Scout," she said. The dog followed. Daniel's carpentry shop stood behind a chain-link fence near the old railroad tracks on the east side of town. It was a long wooden building with peeling white paint, a green metal roof, and windows clouded by years of sawdust. A hand-painted sign still hung over the door, Ellis Woodwork, Custom Cabinets and Repairs. Daniel had painted those letters himself. The sight of them nearly broke Margaret all over again. Ruth parked near the entrance. Margaret sat in the passenger seat staring at the shop as rain slid down the windshield. Scout sat in the back, silent and watchful. "You do not have to do this today," Ruth said gently. Margaret wiped her cheeks. "Yes, I do." They got out. Scout jumped down after them and immediately went to the side door, the one Daniel used when he came early in the morning before unlocking the front. The dog sniffed the threshold, then looked back at Margaret. "You know this place," she whispered. The key felt heavy in her hand. Inside, the shop smelled like Daniel. Pine boards, machine oil, coffee, old varnish, the faint trace of peppermint candies he kept in a jar by the register. Margaret stepped in and gripped the doorframe. For 38 years, this shop had been part of their marriage. Not just Daniel's work, but their life. She had brought him lunches here. Peter had done homework on a stool near the front counter. Margaret had balanced bills at Daniel's desk when business was slow. They had argued here, laughed here, planned holidays here, and somewhere under a floorboard, Daniel had hidden something he could not tell her while alive. Scout moved ahead of them. He walked directly to Daniel's workbench. It stood beneath the back window, cluttered with clamps, pencils, jars of screws, folded sandpaper, and an old radio that no longer held a station clearly. Daniel's favorite stool was still pulled out slightly, as if he had just stepped away. Margaret could not bring herself to touch it. Ruth did. She knelt beside the workbench and ran her fingers along the floor. "Loose board," she murmured. He said beneath the bench. Scout pawed at a narrow plank near the back leg. Ruth looked up. "Well," she said softly, "that answers that." Margaret knelt with effort. Together, she and Ruth pried up the board with a screwdriver from Daniel's bench. Underneath was a hollow space. Inside lay a metal cash box. Margaret recognized it immediately. Daniel had used it years ago to keep receipts before he bought a proper filing cabinet. It was scratched, dented, and locked. Ruth reached into the hollow and lifted it out. There was an envelope taped to the top. Maggie. Margaret's hands shook so badly Ruth had to help remove the tape. Inside the envelope was a small brass key and another note. "My dearest Maggie, I hope I am wrong. If you are reading this, then something has happened before I could fix it. Peter has been taking loans against the shop and forging my signature. I discovered it 3 weeks ago. He said it was only temporary, that he would pay it back, that Caroline did not know. Then I found the second set of papers. He tried to sell the land under the shop. He told the buyer I was ill and no longer mentally fit to manage my affairs. I have copies of everything in this box. I was going to meet attorney Ruth Bennett on Friday morning. I should have told you sooner, but I wanted proof before I broke your heart. Please forgive me. Daniel." Margaret lowered the letter. The room seemed to tilt. Ruth's face had gone pale with anger. "He was coming to me," she whispered. "He called my office. He said he needed to discuss something urgent but would explain in person." Margaret looked at her. "He died Thursday night." Ruth nodded slowly. Scout pressed against Margaret's side and she clung to the dog's damp fur like she might fall without him. The cash box opened with a small metallic click. Inside were bank documents, photocopied loan papers, forged signatures, letters from a development company, and several printed emails. There were also photographs Daniel had taken on his old camera. Peter entering the shop after hours, Peter speaking with a man beside a black SUV, Peter carrying file boxes out the back door. At the very bottom was a small USB drive wrapped in a piece of cloth. Ruth lifted it carefully. "We need to take this to the police," she said. Margaret did not answer. She was looking at one final photograph. It showed Scout lying outside the shop door, thin and wary, while Daniel sat several feet away on an overturned bucket, holding out a piece of bread. On the back, Daniel had written, "He is scared, but he wants to trust someone. Don't we all?" Margaret pressed the photograph to her lips. That was when headlights swept across the shop windows. Ruth turned. A car pulled up outside. Peter. He got out fast, slamming the door behind him. His black funeral coat was open, his tie loosened. Caroline remained in the passenger seat, staring straight ahead, her face white. Peter banged on the shop door. "Mom!" Scout barked once, a deep, sharp bark that echoed through the building. Margaret stood, clutching the cash box. Ruth stepped toward the door but did not open it. "Peter, go home." "I know she's in there," he shouted. "Open the door." Margaret felt fear rise in her chest. Not the fear of a stranger, the worst kind. Fear of someone you had once held as a child. Ruth pulled out her phone. "I am calling Sheriff Dawson." Peter hit the door again. "You do not understand what he was doing. Dad was going to ruin me." Margaret flinched. Ruth's voice became calm and cold. "Peter, anything you say right now may become very important later." There was silence outside. Then Peter spoke again, lower this time. "Mom, please, open the door. Let me explain." Margaret closed her eyes. For one terrible second, she saw him at 5 years old, asleep on Daniel's chest after a summer picnic. She saw Daniel teaching him how to sand wood with the grain, not against it. She saw the boy who used to run through this very shop, laughing when Daniel lifted him onto his shoulders. Then she opened her eyes and saw the forged signatures in the box. She saw Daniel's funeral flowers still damp on her coat. She saw the dog who had followed the hearse because Daniel had trusted him with the truth when he could no longer trust his own son. Margaret walked to the door. Ruth grabbed her arm. "Maggie." "It's all right," Margaret said. She did not unlock it. She stood on one side of the door while Peter stood on the other. "Tell me," she said. Peter's breathing was uneven. "I made mistakes." "Did you forge your father's name?" A long pause. "I was going to fix it." "Did you try to sell the shop?" "Only because he refused to see reason," Peter burst out. "That place is worth more as land than it ever was as a dusty old workshop. He could have retired comfortably. You could have had money. Real money." Margaret's voice broke. "We had enough." "No, you had nothing," Peter shouted. "You had a falling down house, an old truck, and a shop full of junk. I was trying to turn it into something." "You were trying to take it." Peter went quiet. Then his voice changed. "Mom," he said softly, almost gently, "you cannot turn me in. I am your son." Margaret looked down at Scout. The dog stood beside her, body tense, eyes fixed on the door. "Yes," she whispered, "you are." Then she lifted Daniel's note. "And he was your father." Sirens sounded in the distance. Peter must have heard them too because he stepped back from the door. Caroline got out of the car. Margaret saw her through the window. Caroline was crying now, truly crying, one hand over her mouth. Peter turned on her. "Get back in the car." Caroline shook her head. "No." "Caroline." "No," she said louder. "I will not lie for you anymore." Peter froze. Margaret stared through the window. Ruth opened the door just enough for her voice to carry. "Caroline, come inside." Caroline moved quickly, almost running. Peter reached for her arm, but Scout lunged forward with a bark so fierce Peter stumbled back. Caroline slipped inside, soaked and shaking. Ruth locked the door again. "What do you mean you will not lie anymore?" Margaret asked. Caroline covered her face. "He told me it was business. He said Daniel knew. Then Daniel came to our house last week. He had papers. He was so angry, but not loud. He just kept saying, 'You have one chance to make this right.'" Peter followed him out. They argued in the driveway. Margaret's breath stopped. "What happened?" Ruth asked. Caroline looked toward the window where Peter stood in the rain. "I do not know everything," she whispered. "But Daniel said he was going to the police. Peter said he would lose everything. Daniel said, 'Then you should have thought of that before you stole from your own family.'" Margaret's knees weakened. Ruth guided her onto Daniel's stool. Caroline continued, crying harder now. That night, Peter came home late. He said his father had a heart attack. He said grief would kill you if I said anything. Margaret could not move. Outside, Sheriff Dawson's cruiser pulled into the lot, followed by a second car. Peter did not run. Maybe he knew there was nowhere to go. Maybe some part of him had been running for years and was finally too tired to continue. The sheriff stepped out into the rain. Peter turned slowly and raised his hands. By sunset, the town knew there was more to Daniel Ellis's death than anyone had been told. The investigation took weeks, then months. The medical examiner reviewed Daniel's case. The police searched Peter's home, his office, his financial records. The USB drive Daniel had hidden contained audio recordings of conversations with Peter, copies of threatening messages, and security footage from a camera Daniel had installed near the shop after noticing missing documents. No one could prove Peter had caused Daniel's heart attack directly, but they could prove fraud, they could prove forgery, they could prove elder financial exploitation. They could prove that Daniel had lived his final weeks under pressure and fear from the one person he had spent a lifetime trying to love. Peter was arrested. Caroline cooperated with investigators and later filed for divorce. The development company withdrew immediately, claiming they had been misled. The bank froze the disputed loans. Ruth fought like a storm in court, and in time, Daniel's shop was protected. But none of that brought Daniel back. For Margaret, justice did not feel like victory. It felt like standing in a room after a fire, grateful the flames were out, but surrounded by ashes. Through it all, Scout stayed. At first, Margaret told herself he would remain only until she found him a proper home. He needed a bath, vaccinations, food, and a warm bed. He needed someone younger, someone with more energy, someone whose heart was not cracked straight down the middle. But Scout had other plans. The first night after the funeral, Margaret found him lying on Daniel's side of the bed. She almost told him to get down. Instead, she sat beside him and cried into his fur until she had no tears left. The next morning, Scout followed her to the kitchen and sat where Daniel used to stand while waiting for coffee. He watched her with those patient dark eyes, as if he understood the shape of the silence in the house. On the third day, he brought her one of Daniel's old work gloves from the mudroom. On the seventh, he barked until she opened the front door, then led her down the road toward the shop. Margaret had not been able to go back since the night they found the box, but Scout stood at the gate and waited, so she unlocked it. Inside the shop, dust floated in the morning light. Daniel's tools rested where he had left them. The half-finished cedar chest on his workbench still held the pencil marks of his final measurements. Margaret touched the wood. Her hand did not shake this time. "He was making this for someone," she whispered. Scout walked to the corner and nosed a folder lying beneath a stack of sandpaper. Margaret picked it up. Inside was an order form for Margaret Ellis, Project Memory Chest. Notes for Maggie's letters, photos, recipes, and all the little things she keeps saying she needs to organize someday. Delivery date, anniversary. Margaret laughed once, a broken sound that became a sob. "Oh, Daniel." From that day forward, she came to the shop every morning, at first only to sit, then to clean, then to sort. Neighbors began stopping by. Former customers brought stories. A retired carpenter named Joseph offered to help finish pending orders. A young woman from the community college asked if Margaret would consider turning the shop into a training space for students who wanted to learn woodworking. Margaret almost said no. Then she looked at Scout, sleeping in a patch of sunlight near Daniel's bench. Daniel had believed no good thing should be locked away forever. So Margaret said yes. 6 months after the funeral, Ellis Woodwork reopened. Not as a business exactly, as a community workshop. The sign remained the same, but beneath it Margaret added a smaller one. The Daniel Ellis Memorial Workshop. For second chances, honest work, and things worth saving. People came. Teenagers who had never held a saw learned to build birdhouses. Widows repaired broken chairs because they were not ready to throw away the last piece of a life they had shared. Veterans made benches for the town park. Children painted wooden toys at Christmas, and Scout became the heart of the place. He greeted everyone at the door with cautious dignity. He slept beside nervous students until they relaxed. He rested his head on the knees of grieving strangers. He stood watch over Daniel's workbench like it was sacred ground. The town began calling him Daniel's last dog. Margaret called him her bridge, because that was what he had become. A bridge between the life she lost and the life she was still learning how to live. 1 year after Daniel's death, Margaret returned to the cemetery. The morning was clear this time. No rain, no gray sky. Sunlight moved gently through the trees, touching the headstones with gold. Scout walked beside her without a leash. He had gained weight. His coat was clean now, soft brown and white, with that one folded ear still giving him a permanently curious look. Around his neck was a new collar, blue. Margaret had chosen it herself. She knelt at Daniel's grave and placed a small wooden carving beside the stone. It was a dog, carefully shaped from cedar, lying with its head on its paws. Joseph had helped her make it, but Margaret had sanded the final edges herself. "Hello, my love," she said softly. Scout sat beside her. For a while, Margaret said nothing. She listened to the wind in the trees and the far-off sound of church bells. She thought about all the years with Daniel, all the ordinary mornings she had not known were treasures. She thought about Peter, who had written from jail twice. She had not answered yet. Maybe someday she would. Maybe forgiveness was a road she had not reached, but she no longer confused forgiveness with pretending the wound had not happened. I kept the shop, she told Daniel. You probably know that. Ruth says I talk to you like you are hiding behind a tree taking notes. A breeze moved through the grass. Margaret smiled through tears. And Scout is still with me, she continued. He eats too much chicken, steals socks, and snores louder than you ever did, though you would deny that. Scout leaned against her. Margaret placed her hand on his head. He brought me your truth, she whispered. But I think he brought me something else too. Her voice trembled. He brought me back. Scout suddenly stood, his ears lifted. Margaret followed his gaze. At the edge of the cemetery road, near the place where she had first seen him, stood a young woman with a little boy. The boy held a small wooden truck in his hands. Margaret recognized it immediately, one of Daniel's old toys. The woman approached carefully. Mrs. Ellis? She asked. Yes? My name is Anna. Your husband made this truck for my son 2 years ago. I could not pay him then. He told me to bring cookies someday instead. Margaret smiled softly. That sounds like Daniel. Anna swallowed. I heard about the workshop reopening. My son wanted to say thank you. The little boy stepped forward, clutching the truck. Thank you, he said toward the grave. Margaret covered her mouth. Scout walked to the child and sniffed the wooden truck. The boy giggled and scratched his ear. Anna looked at Margaret. People like your husband do not really leave all at once, do they? Margaret looked at Daniel's name carved into stone, then at the child, then at Scout. No, she said quietly. They leave pieces of love behind, and sometimes, if we are lucky, something faithful helps us find them. That evening, Margaret returned home as the sun began to set. For the first time in a year, the house did not look empty when she came up the walk. The porch light was on. She had left it burning herself. Scout climbed the steps ahead of her, then paused at the door and looked back, waiting. Margaret smiled. All right, she said. I'm coming. Inside, Daniel's old work glove lay beside Scout's bed. The memory chest sat finished beneath the living room window, filled with letters, photographs, recipes, and the folded note that had been tied to Scout's collar on the day of the funeral. Margaret had placed it in a small frame, not because it was painful, because it was proof. Proof that love can leave instructions. Proof that truth can travel on tired paws through rain and grief. Proof that sometimes the one who follows us into our darkest day is not there by accident. That night, as Margaret sat by the window with Scout asleep at her feet, she looked out at the porch light glowing softly against the dark. Daniel had been right. No house should look like it gave up waiting, and because of a stray dog with a blue ribbon tied to his collar, Margaret's house never did.